In this video, I'm going to teach you how to build and deploy a responsive portfolio website using React. The website we're going to build has a navbar for easy navigation. It has an animated hero section, an about section with hover animations on the different sections, a fully customizable skills and experience section, a project section with neatly presented data, as well as links to your demos and the source for all of your projects, as well as a contact section with your email, LinkedIn, and GitHub. And the best part is that everything is responsive. In this tutorial, we'll be learning how to set up a React project completely from scratch. We're going to learn how to take a design and translate it into code using Figma. We'll learn React best practices such as file structures, React hooks, and CSS modules. We'll learn advanced CSS techniques such as animations and responsive design. We'll learn how to use JSON to make editing the data in our website easy. And then lastly, we'll learn how to deploy the site for free on a custom domain. By the end, you'll be able to share the portfolio website with friends and potential employers and even add it to your resume as a project. So without further ado, let's get started. So to get started, we'll just open up VS Code to an empty project, and we need to create the boilerplate for our React project. And to do that, we either use Create React App or Vite. And since Vite is a lot lighter, we're going to go with that one. So we need to open up the terminal and we type npm create Vite at latest. For the project, we'll just name it React Portfolio, but you can name it whatever you want. We'll go with the React option, and for this project, we're just going to do it in JavaScript. Now it gives us some instructions which we have to run. So we go into cd react dash portfolio, and we run npm install. So the npm install command basically installs some dependencies which we need to run our React project. And we see that Vite has also created some boilerplate code for the React project for us. Now, before we get started, we also need to install two fonts. And to do that, we go into the terminal and we write down npm install at font source slash roboto and at font source slash outfit. And we just run that. Once we're done with that, we can write npm run dev to run our project locally. And then we can copy this address and paste it in our browser. And it shows us the React project which has been created by Vite. Now the next thing we want to do is take the two fonts that we installed and introduce it into our project. So the way we do that is we go into main.jsx and we just write down import at font source slash outfit and import at font source slash roboto. So basically, whenever we want to use these fonts, they'll be available for us to use in the CSS files now. So we go ahead and save that. Now you'll see that there's loads of files created by Vite for us, but we don't need most of them. So we'll just go ahead and delete them. So we'll delete this vite.svg. We'll delete the assets folder over here. In app.css, there's a lot of styling which we don't require, so we'll go ahead and delete that. In app.jsx, there's also a lot of code which we don't need, so we'll remove the use state over here, all the logos. We will remove this div inside here and just write down hello world. We'll go into index.css and remove most of the stuff here as well. And then in index.html, instead of having the title of our website be Vite plus React, we'll just name it my portfolio. And we can see that it's updated on the top over here. Another thing we want to use in this project is called CSS modules. So what usually happens with CSS is that if two CSS files have the same style with the same name, they usually overwrite each other. But CSS modules allows us to have multiple CSS files using the same class names, but the styles won't overwrite each other as long as they're imported into separate React files. So to do that, first we want to go into vite.config.js. We basically want to add another parameter over here which says CSS modules locals convention and camel case. This lets us use camel case in all of our CSS modules styles, which you'll see later. But for now, it's not too important. And another thing we want to do is we want to rename the app.css over here to app.module.css. And this is basically how you use CSS modules in any project. While we're on the topic of CSS, we also want to use something called CSS variables. So let's go ahead and create a file called vars.css. Now variables basically help us define certain properties such as fonts and colors in a single place, and then just import these variables in multiple other places. This makes it a lot easier to edit these values later on without having to change it around the entire project. So the way to define variables in CSS is that you want to say colon root, and then first we'll define the colors, and the first one will be called colored text, and this will be just by a white, so hash FFF. Next will be the primary color, so color dash primary. This will be hash 576 CBC. Next will be hash color secondary. This will be hash 19376D. Next we have color dash dark, hash 0B2447. We have color dash BG for the background. That'll be hash 04152B. And then we're done with the colors. Let's just add some variables for the fonts as well. We'll just say font dash roboto. So we're done with the variables. Next, we want to add some styling to the entire website. So we do that in index.css. There are some stylings which we want to apply to every single element in our web page. And to target every element in our web page, we use the asterisk. And we say box sizing of every element should be border box. This basically means that the border is considered when calculating the width and the height of the object. For every element, we want a margin of 0, and we want a padding of 0 as well. And for the font family, as a default, we want to use outfit, but if that's not available, use Arial. Otherwise, use Helvetica, and then as a default, just use any sans serif font that's there. So that's it for our index.css. Next, we want to add some styling to our app, which can be seen over here. So we'll first create a div. And now we see that it's failed to resolve the import of app.css, and that's because we renamed it to app.module.css. So the way to import CSS modules is to say import styles from /app.module.css and go ahead and save that. And the way to apply any styling is to say class name. Instead of passing in a string, we pass in a variable. To do that, we use curly braces and we say styles.app. Now, the .app is the actual class name which we have to define inside our CSS file. So we go into app.module.css and we say .app. We give it a background color of dash dash color dash BG. We say that the width should be 100% of the width of the page that it's on. The height should be 100% as well of the page that it's on. And then since we're using a variable, we have to import it from the vars.css file. So we do that by saying @import /vars.css. And we end that with the semicolon and save that. Another thing we have to do is to add the assets we'll be using, such as images and icons. So we'll just create a folder called assets. And I've just gone ahead and dropped in a few images, which you can go ahead and find in the GitHub repo linked in the description down below. Or you can get it from Figma, which is also linked in the descriptions. And we'll be going over that as well. And along with these images, I've also added a favicon inside the public folder. And what that does is it basically renders out the icon on the tab over here that you usually see. And to use it, we go into index.html And you see this line which says link icon. We replace image slash svg plus xml with image slash png, and we replace v.svg with slash favicon dot ico. And it won't show up right now because of the cache in your browser, but we'll see it later. The second last thing we want to do is to create a utility function which can actually use the images inside the assets folder. So we'll go ahead and inside src, we'll create a file called utils.js. And we want to create a function and we want to export it. So we'll say export const and we call it get image URL. And what this will do is it'll basically take a path which we will pass to it. And this path will be relative. And what this function will do is it will construct the absolute path of whatever image is there. So we'll return a new URL. And we want the path to be assets slash, and we're using string interpolation here. So we'll pass in the path which we have passed in. And we want this relative path to be appended to import.meta.url. And then we want to get the href of this and return that back. And essentially, again, what this is doing is that it's taking a relative path which we pass to it. It's taking the base URL of our website, appending this relative path onto it, and then passing us back whatever this URL is. And this will basically make it easier for us to dynamically import images into our different components. And the last thing you want to do is that you want to go into the description down below and you want to find the link for the designs in Figma and you want to open that up. In most tech companies, Figma is used to design the websites and components, and then these designs are given to engineers to convert into code. This is great because it gives you details about the different dimensions, font sizes, and colors of the different components on the website. And for this project, we have two designs, one for the standard view and one for the responsive mobile view, which we'll be using to create our web pages. So now that we're done with the setup, let's get started with the actual coding. So the first component we'll be looking at is the navbar. And to get started, we should look at the design in Figma. So when you open up the design, you see that the navbar is at the top over here. On the left-hand side, it just says portfolio. You could rename it to anything you want. And on the right-hand side, we have the different sections in our page like about, experience, projects, and contact. And by the way, when you open up Figma, there's two different modes. One is for design and one is for developers. And this makes it a lot easier to understand what's going on, especially if you're trying to code an existing design. Um, so if you hover over a particular element, you can go ahead and click on it and you can find out separate different things about it, like the color, the font size, the font weight, and everything else. And then if you have an element selected and you hover over another element, you can find out the spacing between it. So over here, we can see that the spacing between the portfolio and the about is 429 pixels. And this is important because if we have multiple elements laid out like this, and we want to see the gap between each of them, we can see it's 47 pixels over here. So we have a good idea about what it looks like in the standard view. And in the narrow view, we see that instead of being horizontal, all the elements are vertical, and we also have a hamburger menu element over here and a cross icon over here. And in the design, if you see any images or icons and you want to download them, you can go ahead and click on them. And the bottom over here, there'll be an export window or tab. And you can just click on PNG or JPEG or whatever and click on export image 17 or whatever it says. I would recommend using PNGs since they have transparencies in the background. So now that we understand what the design looks like, we can go ahead and get started on actually creating the code for it. So we'll go back into the development webpage. We'll go ahead and close all of these tabs over here. And then inside the src folder, we'll create a folder called components. And this is where all of our components will lie. And then the first component we're building is the navbar. So let's create a folder for that. And then we'll create the JSX file for this. By the way, if you're using Vite, don't create .js files, use .jsx because that is what Vite accepts. So we'll say navbar.jsx. And we'll also go ahead and create the CSS file. So we'll say navbar.module.css because remember we're using CSS modules. Now we'll go into navbar.jsx and I have an extension in VS Code which basically lets me write down RAFC and create some boilerplate code for us. And then what we want to do is we want to import it into our app.jsx. So we'll go into app.jsx and we'll delete this hello world over here and we'll open up the bracket and write down navbar and VS Code should automatically import the component for you and we'll go ahead and close it and we save it, and on the right hand side you can't see it right now because the text is in black, but the text has been updated in navbar. So to see a bit better, we'll temporarily go into app.module.css and add a styling of color white so we can actually see the text. Now we'll go back into navbar.jsx and add in the actual markup, which is the HTML for this component, and we'll add the CSS later. So we'll remove the div that we created, and we will be using a semantic HTML tag. A semantic HTML tag is basically a tag which behaves just like a div, but it has a special name which lets the browser know what its function is. So in this case, we'll be using the nav HTML tag, and then inside that, we want an A tag, and we want the href to be slash, which basically takes us back to the home page, which is basically to the top of the page. So that whenever we click on the text which says portfolio, it'll take us to the top of the page. So if we click on that, it reloads the page and it takes us to the top. So now that we have the A tag, we actually want to create the separate links that we had on the right hand side. So we'll create a div, and inside that, we'll create an unordered list. And each unordered list element will be one of the links that we had. So we'll create a list element, and the list element will have an A tag, and the first one will be about, and we want the href to be hash about. And this hash about basically lets us navigate to that particular section in the page once this about is clicked. We'll see how that works later on. But we'll go ahead and copy this a few times. So the next section is experience. Again, the next section is projects. And the last section is contact. So we have all of the elements that we need over here on our web page, but of course they don't look really nice and we want to lay them out horizontally and we want them to look nice. And of course for that we have to use CSS. So let's get started by adding some class names. So to the nav over here, we want to add a class name of styles.navbar. Styles. And I think we should also import the styles from our style sheet. So we'll say import styles from ./navbar.module.css. The A tag should have a class name of styles.title. This div over here should have a class name of styles.menu. This unordered list over here, for now we'll give it a class name of styles.menu items. And that's about it for the class names for now. So we'll go into navbar.module.css and begin adding the styles. So of course we begin by importing the variables which we created. So we say import // vars.css, since that's where it's located. First we'll add styling to the navbar itself. So we'll say navbar, and of course we have to add a semicolon over here. We'll position it relative. We'll give it a display of flex and align items to center of the row, and we'll say justify content space between, because we basically want to space out the portfolio text to the left and the elements to the right. We'll give it a padding on the top of 61 pixels. And again, if I'm using something and it doesn't make sense, you should go into the Figma. If we click on the portfolio element and we hover to the top of the page, we'll see that it's 61 pixels of margin between that text and the top of the page. We'll also give it a z index of 2. That's because we'll be adding some floating elements later on and we want this to show up above those elements. And then we'll give it a margin. We'll give it a vertical margin of 0% and a horizontal margin of 10% on either side. So it's a bit more spaced out horizontally. For the title itself, we want the font size to be 30 pixels. We want the font weight to be 600. We want to remove all text decorations such as the underlines. So we say text decoration none. And we say the text color. We use the variable keyword, which is why we define the variables in vars.css. And then we can basically use this dash dash color dash text variable name. So we copy that over. And we have the portfolio text over here. And the great thing about this dash dash color dash text variable is you can rename this anything later on if you want to redesign your website, and it makes it a lot easier. So now that we're done with that, let's add some styling to our dot menu. We'll just say display flex for now. And again, this dot menu div isn't important right now, but it'll be important when we add responsiveness to this component. So just hold on for that. For the dot menu items, we'll say display flex. Each of these elements should have a gap of 47 pixels between them. And then you see these bullet points over here. We don't want those, so we'll say list dash style none. And we see that it's laid out in a row now, and we don't have the bullet points anymore. Now for each of the elements inside the list over here, we can target that by saying dot menu items A, and that targets the anchor tags inside the menu items. We want to say font size of 25 pixels, color var dash dash color dash text, and then we'll say text decoration of none. So we can remove the underlines over here again, text decoration. And we can go back into app.module.css and remove the colors over here. And I know right now it seems very scrunched up together, but that'll improve once we make it responsive, because anyways, at this point, it should become into a hamburger menu. So now that we're done with the standard sizing, let's make it responsive. And to make it responsive, we have to add the hamburger menu icon and some JS functionality to it. So we'll go back into navbar.jsx. And to begin with, we need to import a few things. So we'll import use state because we need to keep track of whether the hamburger menu is open or not. And we'll also import the function we made for the images called get image URL from // utils. And we'll go ahead and save that. And we're getting this error basically because we had assets / path, but it should be /assets / path. So we'll go ahead and save that and refresh, and it's okay as normal. Back into navbar.jsx. Inside this menu, we want to add an image. We'll give it a class name of styles.menu.btn. And then the source tells HTML which image to render. And for now, we'll just render one image, but later on, it should be based on the state of whether it's open or not. So we'll say get image URL, and we'll say nav/menu icon.png. And we got this value because inside the assets folder, we have a nav folder, and that has the menu icon.png. And we can see that it's rendered out over here. We also need to add an alt property, so we'll say alt menu dash button, and go ahead and close that and save. Now what we want to do is we want to render out this list on our right hand side differently when the width is below a certain amount of pixels. So we'll go into navbar.module.css, and basically how we make websites responsive is using media queries, which basically means we give different styles to our classes based on the width of the page. So we say at media, we apply it to the screen. You can use other devices here, but we'll just use screen for now. And we'll say and max width 830 pixels, which is saying that apply the styles inside this only up to a width of 830 pixels. Now for the .navbar, which we define on the top, we'll keep most of these properties, and whatever is defined inside will be added on top of it. So we'll say flex direction, and instead of being row, we want it to be column now, and we want the align items to flex dash start. And then for .menu, we barely had any styles for it here, but we'll add a lot over here. So we'll say position absolute, since the menu that's shown is above everything else. We'll say it should be 0 pixels from the right of the page. We'll give it a margin right of 10% of the page. We'll give it a flex direction of column. We'll give it align items of flex dash end. For each element, they'll have a vertical gap of 11 pixels. And then the Z index should be 3. We'll go into .menu btn. We'll say display should be block, and the cursor should be a pointer whenever we go over it. So now we see that the cursor turns into a pointer when we're above this image. Now for the menu items themselves, we'll say menu items, display none by default, flex direction to be column, align items to center, gap of 13 pixels. And just so you can see the different elements, while we're editing, we'll remove this display none for now. And app.module.css, we'll give it a height of 100% of the viewport height. So now you can see the text that was there. It was there, it's just that it was white, so you couldn't see it. We'll go back to navbar.module.css. We'll give it a border radius of 10 pixels. We'll give it a background of RGB 25, 55, 109. And this is just a fallback because next we're going to give it a linear gradient, and if the browser doesn't support that, it'll go back down to this solid value. So we'll say background again, and we'll say linear gradient, and we'll say 0 degrees, which basically means vertical. RGBA, which is the starting value, so 25, 55, 109, 0.2, and 0%. And then the final value of this gradient should be RGBA 25, 55, 109, and an opacity of 1, and at 100% of the gradient. We go ahead and save that, and we see we have a nice gradient going on over here. We'll give it a padding, since it's all a bit too close together, of 24 pixels by 33 pixels, and it's a lot more spaced out now. And we'll give it a shadow of 0 horizontal and vertical, 4 pixels of blur, RGBA 0, 0, 0, 0.25, and go ahead and save that. So now it's visible even though we don't want it to be visible. So we'll go back, and as we had, we'll say display none. And we'd also go ahead and remove the temporary styling we added to app.module.css. So now that we're done with the styling of it, we want to add the functionality of it being able to be opened and closed. So we'll go back into navbar.jsx, and we'll use useState to create a stateful variable. So we'll say const menu open and set menu open, and we'll say use state of false by default because we want the navbar to be closed by default. And then in this image over here, we originally just passed in the menu icon, but we want this to be based on whether the menu is open or not. So we'll say is menu open? Question mark. If it is open, we want it to show the close icon, and if it's not, we want it to show the menu icon. So we'll say get image URL nav/close icon, and if it's not open, then show the menu icon. Now, of course, we want to click on this image and it should change the value inside the menu open. So we'll say on the image, on click, create an arrow function, and this should say set menu open, and it should be the opposite of whatever the current value is. So we'll say not of menu open. So that when it's false, it'll turn into true, and when it's true, it'll turn it into false. And we'll go ahead and save that. And now we see that clicking on it changes the icon. Now we also want this clicking to open up the navbar and close it based on the value. So over here, remember we gave a class name to this unordered list of menu items. Well, we want to keep this menu items, but we also wanted to have a style of menu open based on whether the menu is open or not. So to do that, we wrap this in tildes and we basically do string interpolation. So this is essentially the same as it was before, but what this allows us to do is it allows us to add another class name, and that will depend on the menu open variable. So we'll add an and this basically means if menu open is false, then the style after this and isn't applied. But if it's true, the style will be applied. And we want to give it a style of menu open. Now, of course, we haven't defined this style yet, so we'll go back into navbar.module.css and we'll say that if dot menu open, then we want the display to turn from none to flex, and we'll give it a z index of 1 so it's above everything else. And now once we click on the icon, we see that the menu is presented and we can close it. Another thing is that if we click on an element inside the navbar, we want to close the menu again because it will scroll to the bottom of the page, and a good user experience is that it should close by itself. So we'll go back into navbar.jsx and say that whenever the unordered list is clicked by onClick, arrow function, and do set menu open to false. And now we have a menu which opens and closes, and once you click on it, it closes as well. And you'll see that once we click on an element, the URL also changes, which will play a part in going to the separate sections whenever we click on an element in the navbar. So the next section we'll be taking a look at is the hero section. And as always, we should first take a look at the designs to see what we have to make. And the hero section is this area over here with the image and this text and this button over here. So we see that we have a title text over here, a description, a button which takes you to contact me, and an image over here. What the design doesn't show is that this image is slightly animated, but we'll add that once we're coding the website. And then for the narrow view over here in the mobile view, we see that instead of being horizontal, everything is vertical, but essentially the same. The image is just a bit smaller, and it's supposed to be below the navbar. And again, if you want any details about the font size, the font color, and the gaps or anything, you can go into the Figma and see it over here. So without further ado, let's get started creating this component. So we'll go ahead into the components folder and create a new folder for the hero section, and we'll call it hero. We'll create hero.jsx and hero.module.css. Inside hero.jsx, we'll run rafc to create the boilerplate code. Go into app.jsx, import the hero component, and then in hero.jsx, we will delete this hero over here, as well as these two divs. And we'll start by another semantic HTML tag called section, which basically denotes that this is a section. Inside this, we'll put a div. This div will contain all the text on the left-hand side of the page. This will have an h1. The h1 will say, hi, I'm Ada, Of course, you can replace this with whatever name you have. Then we'll have a paragraph, and we'll just say, I'm a full stack developer with 5 years of experience using React and Node.js. Reach out if you'd like to learn more. And we'll just save that. And then lastly, we had a button, if you remember. In our case, we'll just use an A tag. In the href, instead of pointing to a website, we'll say mail to, and it'll say my email at email.com. But you replace this with whatever email you have. And what this does is that once somebody clicks on this link, they'll be taken to their own email client, and it'll automatically fill in the to section with your email over here. And then for the text, we just say contact me. Alongside this div, we have the image which we saw. For the src, we'll say get image URL, automatically import that. And the path we'll pass into it is hero/hero image .png. We'll give it an alt of hero image of me, and we'll give the class name later, and we'll go ahead and save that. And we see we have the image over here. And then lastly, if you would have noticed inside the Figma design, we see that there are two highlights on the background of the page. And to do that, we'll have to create two divs over here. So we'll say div, and we'll give it a class name of styles dot top blur, and we don't need a closing tag for that. We can just automatically close that. And then we'll create another div called bottom blur, and we'll just save that. And of course, this errors out because we haven't imported styles. So we'll say import styles from /hero.module.css and save. So now that we're done with the HTML, let's go ahead by creating the styles. So for the section over here, it'll have a class name of styles.container. This div will have a class name of styles.content. For the h1, class name styles.title. The p has the class name of styles.description. And then the a tag has a class name of styles.contactbtn. The image, give that a class name of styles.heroimg, and go ahead and close that. And that should be all the class names we have to add. So now we can go and define the CSS styles. So of course, we'll first import //vars.css semicolon. Oh, sorry, one more dash, and save that. First, we'll add the styling for the container. So .container. We'll give it a position of relative, display flex, align items to the center, justify content to be space between, so that there's space between the text and the image. Margin on the top of 49 pixels. Z index of 1, again because we have the highlights in the background and we want this to be above that. Margin left of 10%. Margin right of 10%. Next, we'll go on to the content. So we'll say display flex, flex direction column, align items flex start, color, We'll use a variable dash dash color dash text, and we'll give it a z index of 1 as well. For the title, we'll give it a font size of 72 pixels, font weight of 900, so it's a bit more bold. We'll give it a margin at the bottom of 33 pixels, so it's a bit more spaced out from the description. Font family, if you notice in the design, it's actually Roboto, not the default. So we'll say var dash dash font dash Roboto. And the font hasn't changed because in vars.css we did not add Roboto. And now you see that it's changed. With the background, we want to give it a linear gradient because if you see in the designs, it's not fully white, it's a sort of gradient as it goes to the right. So we'll say background linear dash gradient 90 degrees, which basically means horizontal. The first value is RGBA 255, 255, 255, 1 at 70% into the element. And then the second value is RGBA 255, 255, 255, 0, and that is 120% into the element, which is outside it. And I know it looks weird right now, but to fix this, we add dash webkit dash text dash fill dash color, and we give it a value of transparent, and then dash webkit dash background clip, and we give that a value of text. And we see now that it looks a lot better and has a gradient. Next, we add the styling for the description, so dot description. We say font size should be 30 pixels. Font family, again, Roboto. And then we give it a margin at the bottom of 52 pixels. And I'm just realizing that this should be dot content. Save that, and now we see that the text is actually white. Now let's add the styling for the contact button, so dot contact btn. We don't want to remove any text decoration like underline, so we'll say text decoration none. Background color should be var dash dash color dash primary. The color of the text should be var dash dash color dash text. We want to give it a border radius of 100 pixels. We want the font size should be 30 pixels. Font weight should be 600. And the padding should be 17 pixels and 26 pixels. And then lastly, we want to add a box shadow. So we say box dash shadow 0, 0, 4 pixels, 0, RGBA, 0, comma, 0, comma, 0, comma, 0.25. Go ahead and save that. And then I know it looks weird right now, but anyways, at this point, it should be vertical instead of horizontal. So we'll take a look into responsive design in a bit. First, we want to add some animation to the hero image. So we say dot hero img. We say the width should always be 50% of the page. So now it looks a lot better. And we want the z index again to be 1, so it's above the highlights in the background. And now let's add the animation. So to do this, we need to first define an animation name, which we'll be using. So we'll say animation dash name, and we can use anything. We'll just call it floating. The duration of the animation. So we'll say this animation should run for 3 seconds. Animation iteration count, which basically defines how many times this should run. So we'll say infinite, because we want this image to keep going up and down. And the animation timing function. This basically defines what the movement looks like Ease in out basically means that whenever we reach a keyframe, the movement into it and out of it should be eased, if that makes any sense. Anyways, now we have the animation defined, but of course it won't do anything because we haven't defined the translation of the position of the element. So over here we use at keyframes, and then we use the name that we used over here, which is floating. So we're essentially defining the keyframes for the floating animation. So at 0% of the animation, we want the transform of the element to translate 0 and 0 pixels. At 50%, we want the transform to translate 0 and positive 10 pixels. And then at 100%, we want the transform to translate 0 and minus 10 pixels. If we save that, we now see that the image is hovering up and down. And my bad, there should not be minus 10, there should be minus 0. And now we see that the image is properly hovering up and down. So now that we're done with the animation, let's add the gradients in the background, those highlights that we saw. So dot top blur. We say position, absolute, width, 50% of the viewport width, height, 50% of viewport width. The min width should be 350 pixels. The min height should also be 350 pixels. The top should be minus 128 pixels, which means it's slightly outside the page. And then similarly, the left should be minus 10 viewport width. The border radius should be 764 pixels. Background should be RGBA 25, 55, 109, and 0.7 opacity. We want to put a filter on it because right now it just looks like a box. Want to put a filter on it of blur 100 pixels. And we see that it's like a nice highlight right now. And we put a Z index of 0 on that. The bottom blur will have similar properties. So we'll just copy this. And we'll say bottom blur. Position is absolute, width should be 70 pixels. Height is 70% of the viewport width. Height is fine as it is. The min width should be 250 pixels. The top should be 246 pixels. And the left should be minus 10 for the top one, my bad. And the right for the bottom one should be minus 25 viewport width. The border radius should be 764 pixels, and sorry, for the top one as well, there should be border radius. Over here, the RGBA value should be the same. The blur is the same and the Z index is the same as well. And now we see we have two highlights behind the hero image, which look really beautiful. So now that we're done with the standard CSS, we need to make it responsive because right now if you make it very narrow, it doesn't look that good. We want it to be vertical instead of horizontal. So we'll use media queries again at media screen and max dash width to be 830 pixels. For the dot container, the flex direction was column. The flex direction was row, my bad. Now we just want it to be column, but in reverse. So because if we put column right now, the image will be at the bottom. So we say column reverse, and now it's at the top. And then for the dot content, which is the text and the button, we just say align items center. And there we have our hero section. And if we open the navbar, we see that it's above the hero section as well. So everything is going great. Now the next section we'll be taking a look at is the about section. So as always, let's take a look at the design. We see that we have a black box over here to demarcate the section. We have the title, an image on the left, three different sections on the right hand side, and we can see that once you hover over it, it has a sort of background gradient. And then there's an icon, some text here. And for the responsive section, we see that the image is completely gone and we don't have the black background and we just have these cards over here. And like before, when you hover over them, we have the linear gradient background. So before we carry on, I actually want you to try to develop this section by yourself before you carry on with this video and take a look at how we implement it. Of course, I don't expect you to be able to do the animation of the background once you hover over it, but I want you to try it out and then come back to the video. Inside the components folder, as always, we'll create a new folder. And I'm just realizing there's a mistake in the folder structure, so we'll go ahead and move this hero folder from inside navbar into the components folder, and we'll say OK. And all the imports seem OK. Let's just refresh and see if everything works. And then we need to go into app.jsx. Instead of saying navbar/hero, we just say ./components/hero. And then inside hero.jsx, the import of utils should only have two dots. And similarly for vars.css, two dots. So now that we fixed that, we'll go ahead and close these folders. And inside the components folder, we also want to rename it because the spelling is wrong. And then all of that is fixed. And then finally, we can go back and inside the components folder, we can create another folder called about.jsx, and about.module.css. And in about.jsx, we say rafc and create the arrow function. And then back into app.jsx, we put it below the hero, so that's the about component is auto imported. And we see there's some about text at the bottom of the page. So now we go back into about.jsx, and as always, the first thing we want to do is add some content into the page. So we'll delete this about and this div, and we'll also make this into a section. And what we'll do is that we'll add an h2 first of all, and this will say about. So this is the title of this section. Then we'll have a div which will have the content of this page. So the first thing inside this should be an image, which is on the left-hand side. The src, we'll use the util function that we have, so get image URL, and we'll say about/about image.png. And then for the alt, we'll just say me sitting with a laptop and go ahead and save that. And we see that we have the image over here. Next, we want to have an unordered list which shows up on the right-hand side of the image. We'll say ul. Each of these will have an li, and the li will have an image to go along with it. The src will again use the get image URL, and it'll say about/cursor icon.png, and the alt will just say cursor icon and save that. And we see that the cursor icon isn't rendering because we need to write down cursor icon, and now it's being rendered over there. And then next to the image, we have a bunch of text, so we put that inside a div, and then inside that we'll have an h3 which will say front-end developer, as well as a p tag which will say I'm a front-end developer with experience in building responsive and optimized sites, and save that. And then we have one of our cards created, so we'll do the same thing a few more times. We'll copy this li. The next li should show a server icon, and then we'll change the alt to server icon. We'll say backend developer, and then write down I have experience developing fast and optimized backend systems and APIs. Save that. We'll see that's rendered as well. And then after that, the last one should be UI designer. And again, you can add any content you want over here, depending on the skill sets that you have. So I have designed multiple landing pages and have created design systems as well. and go ahead and save that. So it's a pretty simple component over here. We just have this markup, no interactivity or nothing being rendered dynamically. So what we can do next is add the styling for it. And to do that, of course, we first import the styles from the CSS. So we'll say import styles from /about.module.css. This section will have a class name of styles.container. This h2 will have a class name of styles.title. This will be styles.content. To this image, we'll add a class name of styles.aboutImage. This unordered list will have a class name of styles.aboutItems. For each of these list elements, we'll give it a class name of styles.aboutItem. And we'll go ahead and copy this into the other li tags as well. And then I forgot over here, we want to change the alt for this cursor icon to UI icon. And then for the divs over here, we want them to have a class name of styles.aboutItem text. And we'll just copy this and apply it to the other ones as well. So this div and this div. We'll go ahead and save that, and now we can begin adding the styles. So we'll go into about.module.css. We'll import our variables, so at import /vars.css. So for .container, we want the position to be relative. We want the background color to be RGBA 12, 12, 12, and 0.6. And we want the semicolon over here, and we save that. We want the border radius to be 15 pixels. We want the padding to be 73 pixels. The margin on the top should be 129 pixels. The Z index should be 1, so it's above any of the background gradients that we have. Because as you'll see in the design, the box is slightly above this gradient over here. And this is also why we made it position relative. And we'll give it a margin on the left of 10% of the page and margin right of 10% of the page. And we'll save that. And we see that the box is created nicely. The next thing we want to do is add the title. So the color should be a variable, and we will say dash dash color dash text. The font size should be 35 pixels. The font weight should be 700. The letter spacing, we want that to be 1.75 pixels. And then we want the text transform to be uppercase. So no matter what the text is, every letter will be uppercase, as you see over here. In dot content, all we want to do is make it display flex direction row, and align items to the center. And then in the dot about image, we set the width to be 35% of the page. And it's not showing up in a row because over here there should be styles.content. And now we see it's beside each other. In dot about items, we want the color to be color dash text. And everything is in white text now. We want the display to be flex. We want the flex direction to be column. And we want a gap of 50 pixels between each item, so it's a bit more spaced out. Now let's address each of the items. So we'll say display should be flex direction should be row, align items to the center, border radius to 20 pixels. We want to remove any list style that we have over here in this bullet point. So we say list style none. We'll put a padding of 25 pixels on each of these items. And then we want to add a background image, which is the linear gradient. So we'll say linear gradient, 90 degrees, so it's horizontal. RGBA, so 165, 215, 232, and 0.42 opacity. And that should start at 0% into the element. And then RGBA, 255, 255, 255, 0 opacity. And that should end at 100% of the element. And we see we have the gradient. And then we don't want this gradient to always be visible. We only want it to be visible when we're hovering over it. So right now we're going to set the background size to be 0 and 100%. And now what we'll say is we want on about item, whenever we hover over it using the hover pseudo selector, we want the background size to be 100% and 100%, and go ahead and save that. Now when we hover over it, we see that it's visible. Now we also wanted to have a neat animation where it goes from the left hand side to the right hand side. So we'll add two things over here. We'll say that the background repeat should be no repeat. And then we'll say that the transition should be 0.4 seconds. And this basically says that if any transition is happening, it should take 0.4 seconds. So we see now that once we hover over it, the background size changes over 0.4 seconds. Next, let's add some styling to the elements inside the about item. So dot about item. And if you want to target any H3 inside it, we just write down H3 over here. And we say that the font size should be 25 pixels. And the font weight should be 600. And save that. And we see that the titles look a lot better. And then for the paragraph, we say about item P and say the font size should be 25 pixels. And of course, right now it looks very big. That's because it's not responsive yet, but we're going to go ahead and add that right now. So we saw that we want some responsive elements. So to do that, we'll add the media query, add media screen and max dash width of 830 pixels as always. And we want to add a style to the container. We want the background color to be transparent instead of white. We want any padding to be removed. So padding left 0 and padding right also 0. In the dot content, we want the flex direction to go from row to column. For the dot about image, we don't want it to display at all, so we'll say display none. For dot about items, we want the margin at the top to be 29 pixels. And then for each about item, we want the padding left and padding right to be 0. And we'll go ahead and save that. And we see that in a narrow screen, it looks a lot better now. Now there is one more last thing we want to do before we can say that we're done with this section. Back in about.jsx, we want to go to the section tag over here and give it an ID of about. And basically what that enables us to do is we can open up the navbar, and once we click on about, we navigate all the way to the about section because the URL has changed to #about. And this basically tells the browser to navigate to the element with the ID of #about. Now you saw that the scrolling behavior wasn't very smooth, and that's because we have to add a property to enable the smoothness. So we'll go over here into index.css and we'll say HTML scroll dash behavior smooth. And if we save that and go back, and we click on about, we see that we scroll down smoothly to that section. So that's it for this about section. Next, we'll be working on the experience section. So again, let's take a look at the design. We see that on the left-hand side, we have a bunch of skills laid out in a grid pattern. And on the right-hand side, we have some experience laid out in a column over here. And then the responsiveness is pretty simple. Instead of them being in a row next to each other, they're instead in a column. So as we can see, the component over here is pretty data intensive, and a lot of this can change over time, like the skills you know can change over time, and your experience obviously can change. And whenever that happens, you don't want to be changing your JavaScript files directly, your React components. And to make it easier for you to change the data as you gain more experience and skills, we'll be using something called JSON files. So JSON files are basically files in which you can write down any data which you want to store, and they can easily be imported by our React JavaScript files, and they can be rendered out programmatically. So without further ado, let's get started with the component. We'll go ahead and close all of these tabs over here. Inside the components folder, we'll create a new folder called experience. We'll create experience.jsx and experience.module.css. In app.jsx, as always, we'll go ahead and import that, so experience. And first we need to actually run the rafc command to create the component experience. Go ahead and close that. And it's there at the bottom of the page. We go back into experience.jsx and we will go ahead and delete this, but before that we need to create the JSON files which will contain our data. So as a sister to the components folder in the src folder, we'll create another folder for the data which we have. And we'll create two files. We'll create skills.json and we'll create history.json. Now the data to enter into this obviously depends on your history and your skills. But if you want some dummy data, you can go to the repo linked in the description and you can go ahead and find this. And by the way, if you're following till now and you've liked the video, please do like it and subscribe. It really helps out. And if you have any other ideas for other tutorials or videos, please do leave them down in the comments below. But let's go ahead and just copy paste the data over here. So the data has been pasted and you'll see that it's pretty similar to JavaScript syntax. So in this JSON file, all we're doing is exporting an array, and each of these array elements is an object with a field of title and an image source, which will be rendered out by the React component. And for history.json, again, it's an array of objects, and it has fields such as role, organization, start date, end date, experiences, which is also an array, and image src, which is a link to an image in our assets folder. So we'll go ahead and go back into experience.jsx and we'll get started with rendering our data. So we'll delete this div, we'll create a section, and then we'll just go ahead and give it an ID of experience to begin with so we can scroll to it. We'll give it an h2 and the h2 will be experience. Create a div, and inside that div we'll create another div which will contain all of our skills. And then the sister to that will be an unordered list which will contain our experiences. So in the skills section, what we want to do is we want to render out each of our skills in the data over here. And to do that, we first need to import this data into our component file. So on the top, we'll go over here and we'll say import skills from data slash skills.json. And then now this is an array variable like anything else you would define in JavaScript. So what we can do is go inside this div, add curly braces since we'll be using some JavaScript for rendering out the data. And we'll use some array function. So we'll say skills.map. So go through each element and map it to something else. At each index, we'll take in the skill that's there over in that position, as well as the ID, which is generated by the map function, if you know about it. We'll use an arrow function. And using parentheses, we'll say that map each of these elements into a div. And we need to return, wrap this with curly braces and say return. Inside the div, we want to give this an ID because whenever you're iterating through an array and programmatically creating elements in React, you need to give each element an ID. So we'll say key is equal to ID. The first child inside this will be another div. which will contain the image. So we'll say image src, and we'll say that the source of the image should be get image URL. Instead of hard coding the value, you'll remember that in skills.json, each of these has an image src field. So we'll just say skill.image src. And the alt is decided by the title of each element. So we'll just say the alt should be skill.title. And we'll save that. And we see all of these images are rendered out. And then next to the image, we also want to render out the title of the skill. So we'll just say P for a P tag. And we want to render out skill.title. And it's being rendered out over here. It's in black, so it's not very visible. So we're done with the skills. And then in this unordered list over here, we want to create the experiences we have. So we'll add curly braces again because we want to programmatically generate this. We'll say history.map, take in a history item and an ID, curly braces. We want to return a list element, an li, and we want to give this the key to begin with, and then an ID. The first thing will be an image, which will be the icon of the company that you worked at. So we'll give this an src, and we'll say get image URL. And instead of hard coding again, we'll go into history.json and just look at the fields over here. We have image src. So you'll say history item.image src. And of course, that's not rendered because we didn't import the history. So we go to the top and we say import history from dot/data/ history.json and save that. And we see that the three icons are rendered out over here. And then we want an alt as well. So we'll just say string interpolation history item dot organization and logo. And then next to this image, we want the details of what we did. So we'll add another div. The first element in this will be an h3. And this will basically have the title of the company and the role that we had. So curly braces, because we want to use string interpolation, tildes, and we'll say history item dot role, and then comma, history item dot organization. So we say software engineer, Google, UI designer, Microsoft. Below that, we'll have a P tag, and then this will have the dates which we were there at the company. So we'll just go ahead and copy this over here. Instead of comma, we have a dash between the two. And instead of role, we'll say start date. And so organization will be end date. And then lastly, we have another unordered list inside this. And in that, we want to add a curly brace. And if you remember, we had an array over here. So we want to go through this and create a list item for each of them. So we'll say history item dot experiences dot map. Take each experience and an ID, arrow function, return an li. Of course, give it a key. And then inside, we just render out the experience that we had. And go ahead and save that. And we see all the data is being rendered out. And if you want to ever change anything, you just have to change it inside the JSON and it'll automatically be changed. So you can add more skills, remove these, and add more experience as well. So now that we're done with rendering out the data, let's add some styling. So as always, we'll import the styles in our file over here. So we'll say import styles from ./experience.module.css. Save that. This section should have a class name. Styles.container. For this h2, we'll give it a style name of title. This div will be called content, this div will be called skills. Each of these divs inside will be called a skill. This div will be called skill image container. And then we go down here to the unordered list and we'll call this styles.history. Each of these list items will have a class name of history item. This div over here, which contains the text, will be called history item details. And then that's pretty much it for the class name. So let's get started with adding the styles in experience.module.css. So as always, we'll import vars.css. The dot container, we'll say that the color should be var dash dash color dash text. And now it's all white. The margin top should be 79 pixels. The margin left should be 10% and same for margin right. For the dot title, we'll say the color should again be color dash text. And we want the font size to be 35 pixels for this. We want the font weight to be 700. We want the letter spacing to be 1.75 pixels. And as before, we want the text transform to be uppercase. Then for the content, we want the display to be flex direction to be row, justify content to be spaced evenly, and then a margin at the top of 14 pixels. And now we see they're both side to side. For dot skills, we want the width to be 45%. We want the display to be flex. We want the flex wrap to be wrap. This basically means that if it's going above, outside the width, it should wrap onto the next row. And then we want a gap between each of the elements of 11 pixels. And now it's neatly laid out into a grid pattern. For each of these skills, so dot skill, we want the display to be flex again. We want the flex direction to be column. And sorry, this gap should be 37 pixels. We want the align items to the center, and we want a gap of 11 pixels. And for the skill image container, we want the background color to be var dash dash color dash secondary. We want the border radius to be circular, so 100%. We want the display to be flex. We want the align items to be center, justify content to be center, a width of 120 pixels, and a height of 120 pixels. You know, it's neatly in a circle. And we want to also target the image inside this. So we'll say dot skill image container img. And we just want to give it a width of 75 pixels. For the paragraph inside this, we want to say dot skill p. We want to say font size 25 pixels, font family, and we want this to be Roboto. And we want the font weight of 500. Now we move on to the history, so dot history. We want the width to be 45% of the page. We want the display to be flex direction and column. And we want a gap of 40 pixels between each item. For each of the items, so dot history item, display flex, flex direction row, align items to the center, a gap of 17 pixels between each of the items. We want to give it a background. We'll say hash 19376D. And it should be a linear gradient. This was just a temporary placeholder in case the linear gradient doesn't work on the browser. So we'll say linear gradient, 90 degrees, so it's horizontal. This value again, then RGBA 25, 55, 109, and 0 opacity and 100%. And this should be at 0%. We see it's a nice linear gradient now. We'll give it a border radius, 10 pixels. And we'll give it a padding of 24 pixels. And it looks a lot neater now. So next what we want to do is we want to target the image. So dot history item ing width, and we'll say 50 pixels. And then in the history item details, we'll just say that the font family should be Roboto. And then we want to target the H3 inside it. So we'll say H3 font size 30 pixels, font weight 500. And we want to target the P as well. So that has a font size of 20 pixels and a font weight of 300. And then for the unordered list, we want to give it a margin on the top of 6 pixels, a list style position to be inside, because you see right now it's going outside of the column structure over here, and now it's inside. Font size of 25 pixels, list style type of disk, so now it's hollow, and now it's a disk that's full. And then we want a margin on the left hand side, so margin dash left, and we'll give that a value of 17 pixels. And over here this should be P, not H3. And that's basically it for the styling of this. So let's go back into wide mode, and we see that it looks pretty nice over here. And now we want to make it responsive, so let's get back into that. As always, we'll use media query, so at media screen and max dash width of 830 pixels. For the dot content, we want to give it a flex direction of column instead of row, align items to the center, and a gap of 34 pixels. So we want the skills on the top and experience at the bottom. For dot skills, we want a width of 100%, flex direction of row, and justify content of center. And then for the dot history, we want a width of 100%, and we want a gap of 9 pixels between each item, which looks a lot neater. And now we have this section responsive as well. So that's about it for the experience section. And if you go to the navbar and click on experience, it doesn't scroll because there's a typo. And now if we click on experience, it scrolls down to that section. So the next section we'll take a look at is the project section. So again, we go into Figma and look at the design. And as we can see, we have a project's title, and then we have multiple cards which have an image, a title, description, some tags with the languages used, and a link to the demo of the project, and a link to the source code of the project. Now we can see that each of these cards is very detailed, and with this basically tells us that we want to extract this project card into its separate component, and then import it into the projects section and render it over there. So we'll take a look at that later on. But first, we'll also take a look at the responsive design. So the only change is that instead of being in a row, it's in a column over here. So now that we know more about the design, let's get started with the code. So we'll go ahead and close all of these tabs over here. And as always, inside components, create a folder for projects. And then we'll create a file called projects.jsx and just run rafc. And then we'll also create projects.module.css. And then we'll go into app.jsx and import the projects component and render it out. And we can see that it's rendered out at the bottom over there. So we'll first render out everything into this projects component, and then we'll move it out into a separate component for the card itself. So what we want to do is firstly, we want to go and we want to delete this div and projects. And we also want to render out the data from a JSON file. Because again, if you have any projects, it'll involve a lot of data and it can be constantly changing. So you want it to be easily editable. So again, you can get this data from the GitHub repo linked in the description. But ideally, you should be using your own data over here. So we'll create another file called projects.json. And let me go ahead and paste the data over here. And you can see that each element inside this array has a title, an image, a description, skills is an array, and then a link to the demo and to the source. So we'll go back into projects.jsx and we'll create a section tag over here. Inside that, we want to add an h2 and just name it projects. And then below that, we'll create a div to contain the projects that we have. And over here, we want to map through the projects array that we have. So first we'll import it. So import projects from dot data slash projects.json. And then we want to say projects.map. And like before, we want to take the project at this ID at this index as well as the ID, arrow function, return. And what we want to do is we want to create a div. So we'll create a div. We'll give it a key of ID. And then we want to render inside it, first of all, the image that we had. The src will be the project.image src. And the alt will be project.title. And we can actually make it a bit nicer. So we'll wrap this in tildes and do some string interpolation and say image of and then the project.title. So that's the image. Below that, we want to have a title for this project. So we'll say h3. And over here, we'll just render out the project.title. Below that, we'll have a paragraph tag with the descriptions. We'll say project.description. Below the P, we'll have an unordered list, which will contain the different skills that we used. So we'll have another curly braces. We'll say project.skills.map. Take a skill and the ID. And we'll say create a list item. Give it a key of ID. And then inside this, just render the skill that we have. And we see that it's being rendered out right now. So once we have the list item being rendered out, below the unordered list, we also want to render the demo and the source buttons. So we'll create another div which will contain these buttons, the links. We'll create an a tag. The href should say project.demo. And then the text will just say demo. And then inside here, we also want the source. So we'll say href is project.source. And then this just says source. And over here, instead of just using project.image src in the source attribute, we want to use the helper function that we have. We'll say get image URL, and we'll go ahead and save that. Now we see all the images and all the text is being rendered out. So now that we've done that, we can see that it's a lot of code in one file, and it can be easily extracted out into another component. So what we'll do is we'll go into projects, the projects folder, and create another JSX file called project card.jsx and project card.module.css. We'll run RAFC, save that, and then inside projects, we want to take everything inside this return statement and cut it from here and return it inside the project card. Now we'll have to make some changes. So first of all, we'll remove the key from here. Instead of having that here, we'll have it over here. So let's import the project card. We'll give it the key and ID. And of course, it's not being rendered out properly because we have a bunch of variables we're using here which we haven't defined yet. So all of these values such as title, description, image, all of that, we'll be taking in as props. So we could just say props over here, or we could use something called destructuring in ES6. And what that basically does is it extracts the value of the variable inside an object directly over here. So instead of saying props, we'll say project. And this is basically equal to saying const project is equal to props dot project. So instead of doing that, we just extract it over here. And we can take this further, and instead of having to say project.image_src project.title, we can do some more destructuring and say from this project variable, take out the title, image src, description, skills, demo, and source. Save that. And then wherever we have project dot something, we can just delete all of these. And a trick in VS Code is if you press Control D or Command D while you've highlighted something, you can select everything else which is equal to that value. And then you can just go ahead and delete it. So we'll save that. And of course, it's not being rendered out still because we have to go back here and pass in the project property. So we'll say project is equal to project. And instead of having the get image URL over here, we'll cut this from here. We'll go into project card and we'll import it over here. And then we see that everything's being rendered out as it was before. So now that we're done with that, we can begin with the styling. So first of all, let's add some styling to the projects.module.css, and then we can add some styling to the cards themselves. So the styling for this is fairly simple. We want to import the variables as always. We say dot container, and we put the semicolon here. And before we do this, we have to actually add the class names over here. So we give this section a class name of styles.container. And obviously we have to import the styles as well. So we'll go here and say import styles from /projects module.css. Save that. So this is styles.container. Go ahead and copy that. This is styles.title. This is styles.projects. And that's about it for this file. Let's go ahead and do that for the project card as well. So we'll import styles from /project card.module.css. And then this div will be named styles.container. This will be named styles.image. This h3, let's give that styles.title. This p, let's give that styles.description. This ul, let's name that styles.skills. Each list item, we'll name that styles.skill. For this div over here, we'll just name it styles.links, and then each of these we'll give a styles.link to them. Now, just to point out the benefit of CSS modules, you'll notice that both this component has a styles.container, styles.title, styles.description, as well as projects.jsx, which is styles.container title. Um, and both of these have the same class names. And if you weren't using CSS modules and you defined the classes in separate CSS files, there might be some overwriting of styles and it would be very messy. But with CSS modules, you can import it into its own components and they don't overwrite each other as long as they're not imported into the same file. So let's get back into the styling. So we'll go into projects.module.css. And for the container, we'll say, we'll give it a margin on the top. So margin dash top. We'll give that a value of 76 pixels. The color, we'll use variables and say dash dash color dash text. Save that. And margin left of 10% and margin right of 10%. Okay, so that's a bit better spaced out. For the title, we use the same styling we usually use. So font size 35 pixels, font weight and 700, letter spacing and 1.75 pixels, and text transform per case. Now, as I said, we're using this .title class name in multiple places and we're redefining it. As an exercise, I want you to figure out by Googling and going on Stack Overflow how we can define global styles even if we're using CSS modules. And I want you to write down in the comments down below if you manage to figure it out. So next we want to add the styling for the dot projects. We'll give it a margin dash top value of 37 pixels. Display flex. Flex direction, we want it to be in a row. Flex wrap, we want it to wrap around if it ever exceeds the width. We want to align the items to center. We want to justify content to center as well. We want to give a gap of 15 pixels between each element and a width of 100. So that's the styles for the projects.module.css. Let's go into project card. Again, import the variables, import vars.css. For the container, we wanted to display flex. The flex direction should be column in this case. We want to give it a border radius of 10 pixels. We want the background to be a linear gradient, 180 degrees. We want the value to be hash 576 CBC and start at 0% into the element. And then the ending value should be hash 132 A53. And then that goes into 100% into the, and there should be a dot. And we'll save that and we see we have a background for this card element. Now we want to add a box shadow to it as well. So we'll say box shadow 0, 16, 14 pixels, 0, and then hash of 04152D. I'll save that. For the padding, we want 18 pixels and 24 pixels. And then the maximum width, we want that to be 345 pixels. For the image itself, we say dot image. We want to give it a margin at the bottom of 26 pixels. And for the title, we want the font size to be 25 pixels and the font weight to be 700. Save that. For the description, we give it a margin top of 6 pixels, font size of 25 pixels, and a font weight of 400. Save that. For the skills that we want to render out, which actually aren't being rendered, let's take a look at that. In project card. It's because we missed a return statement over here, so we'll say return. And now we see that's being rendered out. For dot skills, we say the width should be 100%, margin top should be 14 pixels, display of flex direction in row, flex wrap. So if it ever exceeds the width, it will wrap around to the next row. A gap of 6 pixels between each element, and a list style of none to remove the bullet points. And we see that it's in a row now. And we want to make each of the skills look a bit better. So dot skill, font size 25 pixels, font weight 400, border radius 100 pixels, background of variable dash dash color dash dark, and a padding of 2 pixels and 22 pixels. Save that, and we see that we've rendered out some tags now. Now, next is the links, so dot links. The width of the links container will be 100%. A margin at the top should be there of 26 pixels. The display should be flex. Justify content to space around. And now they're equally spaced apart. And then to make it look a bit nicer, dot link. Text decoration none, so it's not underlined. Color, variable dash dash color dash text to make it look white. Font size of 30 pixels. Font weight of 600. Border radius of 100 pixels. Background of var dash dash color dash primary, and a padding of 1 pixel and 22 pixel. And there we have it. This is the project section, and we notice that we don't really need to add any media queries and make it responsive. It's automatically like that. And that's because of the fact that we're using Flexbox and we're using Flex Wrap. So it automatically converts into a column of cards once the width is narrow enough. And if the width is larger, we see that it goes into a row. And it automatically accommodates any width based on the Flex Wrap property. Another thing you'll notice is that the width is slightly larger than the elements. And you see this white space over here? It's because if we go to the top, this highlight element goes outside of the app, and that pushes the width larger to what the app is. And there's a simple fix for that. We just go into app.module.css, and inside .app we just say overflow, and if anything overflows it, we just say hidden, and the width is back to being normal. We are now at our last section, which is the contact section, which is fairly simple considering everything else we've done. So looking at the design, we just have some text over here, and then we have a bunch of links, one for email and two for websites that you can go to, LinkedIn and GitHub. Of course, you can add anything you want over here. And it's pretty much similar in the responsive layout. It's just that instead of being a row, it's a column. So without further ado, let's get started with the coding of this. So we'll go ahead and close all the tabs again, and then create a new folder called contact. And before we forget, go into projects.jsx, and for this section, just remember to give it an ID of project so that we can scroll to it later on. And then inside the contact folder, create contact.jsx and contact.module.css. In contact.jsx, RAFC, save, go into app.jsx, import the contact, and save it. Go back into contact.jsx, and as I said, it's a pretty simple component. So first of all, we delete this. We go to the bottom and we see the contact text is over there. And we want to use another semantic HTML tag, and this will be called footer. And then we'll put a div over here, which will contain the text on the left-hand side. We'll put an H2 which will say contact, and below that will be a P tag, which will say feel free to reach out. Save that. And then below this div, we'll have an unordered list. For each of that, we'll have a list item, which will be an image as well as an A tag. So save that. The src, of course, we'll use the get image URL function that we have. And this will say contact slash email icon.png. And the alt will be email icon. And we see the email icon at the bottom over here. And for this href, instead of being a link to a website, it will be mailed to, as we did before, my email at email.com and my email at email.com. Go ahead and copy this 2 more times. Instead of email icon over here, there should be LinkedIn icon, and they should say link in icon. And the href for this should be whatever your LinkedIn profile is, https://www.linkedin.com/myname, and the text should be linkedin.com/myname. And then for this, it should be GitHub icon, and this should say GitHub icon. And then the href should be your GitHub profile, https://www.github.com/myname. And the text again should be github.com/myname. And we see all of this rendered out at the bottom. Again, fairly simple component. Now we'll add the styling. So we'll go over here and import the styles first. So import styles from /contact.module.css. Give the footer first an ID of contact and a class name of styles.container. Copy this. Now for the first div, we'll give it a class name of styles.text. And then we'll go into the UL. We'll give it a style of styles.links. For each list item, we'll just say styles.link. Copy that and paste it into each of the list items. And go ahead and save that. Now let's begin adding the styles for this. So we'll go into contact.module.css. Import the variables, import /vars.css dot container, and we need to add a semicolon. Color should be based on the variable color-text. Margin top of 120 pixels. Background color should be variable dash color dash secondary. Display should be flex. Flex direction should be row. Justify content to space evenly. The width should be 100 viewport width. Padding should be 58 pixels vertically and 10% horizontally. And then a gap of 10 pixels between the two sections, the text and the links. Inside .text h2, we say the font size should be 80 pixels. The font weight should be 700. And the letter spacing should be 4 pixels. So the title looks a lot better. For the .text, the paragraph, we say font size should be 40 pixels. Font weight should be 400. and letter spacing should be 2 pixels. Save that. For the links, dot links, display flex as most things, flex direction to column, align items, flex start because we want them to align to the left hand side of the column, list style none, so no bullet points, and a gap of 26 pixels between each element. For each individual link, again, display flex, align items to the center, and then a gap of 25 pixels between each element. And then for the A tag inside the link, color, we'll set that to white. Text decoration, remove the underline, so text decoration none. Font size 30 pixels. Font weight of 400. And letter spacing of 1.5 pixels. And then we go here and see that in a wide format, it looks pretty nice, but in narrow format, it's a bit cramped. So let's write the code for the narrow format. We add a media query, so at media, screen, and max width of 830 pixels. For the dot container, instead of a row, we want it to be a column, so flex direction column, and a gap of 23 pixels. Save that. We want dot text to be a display flex direction column, align items to the center, and then for the dot links, we want align items center. And we need to save width. Save that, and we see that it's now a column instead of a row. And if we make it wider, so congratulations, we're actually done with coding out the entire website. But the issue now is that it's only available on your laptop and you can't really share it with anyone else. So to do that, you actually need to deploy it, and if you want, you can add your own custom domain to it as well. So to do that, we first need to come into VS Code. And one thing you need to know is that you can't publish React directly to the internet. All that browsers accept is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And right now we're dynamically compiling the React into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So to do that, we'll actually first need to stop the npm run dev which we have. And we'll need to run a command called npm run build. And what this will do is it will take all of our React project and convert it into HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and image files. And you'll see it's created a dist folder over here. And that basically has our index.html, the favicon, and then all the assets which we want, such as the images and like a JavaScript file. And it looks like gibberish, but it actually has all of the code which we just wrote down. And to check if this works properly, we can go into the terminal and run npm run preview. And what this will do is it will use the dist folder to run our project and show it in the browser. So if we go into localhost 4173 and paste that over here, we see that the same thing is rendered out as it was before, which means our build process succeeded and we can go ahead and publish this to the internet. Now, there are a few ways of publishing your websites to the internet. Some are paid, some are free. The main free way to publish your portfolio website is to use a service called Netlify. So you can go to netlify.com and you can click on login or sign up and create an account. And then once you're done, you'll be directed over here to a dashboard similar to this. And you might have something which says get started with a new project. I'm going to go down here and it says add new site. I'm going to click on that and I'm going to click on deploy manually. And this will show me this good UI where I can just basically drag and drop any files I want to publish to the internet. So all I have to do is go to the dist folder over here, drag it and drop it into the browser. and then it'll upload all of the files and it'll do some stuff in the backend to get our website ready. And that was very quick. We see that we have the URL for our website, which we can open up by clicking on Open Production Deploy. And now you have your website hosted on Netlify, and it's basically the same website which we made right now, but it's on the internet. So you can take this link on the top over here. You see it's like some random string, and then it ends with .netlify.app, and you can share it with anyone you want. If you don't like this string over here, you can actually change it. So you can go back into Netlify. You can go into options, deploy settings, domain management, and then you'll see the domain over here, which you can share with everybody else. You can click on options and edit site name, and then you can give it any name you want. And as long as it's available and not used by anyone else, you can use it. So we can say code complete portfolio tutorial with React and save that. And looks like that's available. So we have our custom URL now. And we can go ahead and share that. And it's all free. The issue is that we still have .netlify.app in the end. And if you actually want your own name in the website, so like ada.com or something like that, you'll actually have to buy the domain. And for buying domains, what I usually use myself and what I recommend as well is domain.com. So it's a pretty popular service and you might have heard about it before and even used it. And I'd highly recommend this one. And if you go down to the description, there's actually a link which you can use. And clicking on that link would greatly help out the channel if you are intending on buying a domain. We do get a certain commission if you do use the link. And if you use the discount code in the description, you get a 10% discount as well on the domain that you're buying. So do check out the link in the description and use the discount code for a 10% discount. But anyways, all you have to do is type the domain that you want. So let's try scooby.com. And of course, it's not available because it's a pretty common name. But if it is available, you can click on it over here, and then say add a domain to continue. And then you will be prompted to buy it using your credit or debit card. And then you'll be redirected to the control panel of domain.com. And then if you go to the URL and go all the way to the left and replace summary with DNS, this is where you'll have to make the main change in order to let Netlify know that you want to use this URL. So to do this, you first go back into Netlify, and then on this page, the domain management page, you go down here and it'll say add a domain. So you click on that and you type whatever domain you want to use, which you just bought from domain.com. So we say this one and we verify it. And since we've already used Netlify with our domain, it says that this URL is already on the Netlify DNS. But for you, that will not happen. And it'll instead show you 5 values which you have to go ahead and paste into domain.com. So you'll go back into the domain.com control panel and you'll say add name server and you'll write down dns1.p05.ns1.net and copy that. And then you need to do that again 3 times. So DNS2, DNS3, and DNS4. And notice how it says that it takes 48 hours to propagate. That's because the internet is a vast web and the changes need to propagate from one machine to another before you can go to the domain and it'll take you to the Netlify website. And then once you're done with that, you go back into Netlify and just it'll say done. And that'll basically be it. It should automatically add an SSL certificate to your website. So instead of doing HTTP, you can also do HTTPS for your website. But that's essentially how you deploy your website to Netlify for free. And then if you want, you can add a custom domain as well. So that's about it. Congratulations, you learned how to build and deploy a fully responsive portfolio website in React. with the best practices, animations, and easy to edit data. I hope you liked it, and if you did, please subscribe, like this video, and comment below if you have suggestions for more tutorials. And remember, if you want to buy a new domain, use the link in the description and the discount code. But anyways, until next time, thanks for watching.